This week on The Score, what happened 50 years ago at Chappaquiddick? How did World War II soldiers respond to surveys? Will the Virginia General Assembly pass new gun laws? Is David Mamet's new play worth a trip to London? All this and more on The Score, so don't go away.
You're listening to The Score from Bering Drift with your host, Rick Sincere.
Welcome back to The Score from Bering Drift. I'm your host, Rick Sincere. 50 years ago this month, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts drove his car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, setting off a domino effect on his own career and American politics. To look back on this anniversary, I spoke with Dr. Barbara Perry, a historian and presidential scholar at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. We met at her office on Tuesday. 50 years ago this month was a road accident that caused a national, if not international, scandal. We know it as Chappaquiddick. Can you tell me what exactly happened, and then we'll talk about the consequences?
Mm-hmm. If I knew exactly what happened, I think I would be the one and only person, perhaps, other than Ted Kennedy himself. But I can tell you what's in the record. And what is in the record is thus. He was driving on Chappaquiddick Island, just off of Martha's Vineyard. He had been there for a reunion of women who had worked for his brother Bobby the year before in the 1968 presidential campaign. Some had worked for the Kennedys longer than that. They had met at a cottage on Chappaquiddick. There, by even Ted Kennedy's own accounts, lots of liquor flowing. He, according to his story, went to his car to drive a woman who was, again, among this group of women who had worked for his brother, back to a ferry that was to take her back to Martha's Vineyard and the accommodations where she and the other women were staying. He said that he took a wrong turn, started out instead towards the beach at Chappaquiddick, went onto a bridge that had no guardrails, and was probably speeding, and ran off into an inlet there on Chappaquiddick. The car flipped over. He said he did not remember how he got out. He just knew that at some point he bobbed up to the top of the surface. He said he then went down to try to dive for her, but the currents were so swift he just couldn't reach her or find her, and he hoped that she had gotten out as well. And then ultimately went back to tell his friends and his cousin that something had happened, a terrible accident had happened, but he ultimately swam back to Martha's Vineyard. The ferry had stopped running. He swam back to Martha's Vineyard, and he went to sleep, and they did not report the accident until the next morning. In the meantime, the car had been found submerged with the body of Mary Jo Kopechne inside. And depending on the reports, some say that she drowned, some say that she was alive when it hit the water, and that she struggled and depleted an air pocket and suffocated.
It sounds rather gruesome. Now, by coincidence, this event happened the same time as the moon landing, so it wasn't the top headline the next day, but eventually it became a major news story of the summer of 1969. How did that play out?
It did when ultimately, after a week went by, and after many advisors had convened at Hyannisport, the Kennedy compound, to meet with Senator Edward Kennedy and his family members and his advisors. Ultimately, after a week, he finally went on national news, went on to give a statement about his recollection as best he could come up with it of what had happened, and said to the voters of Massachusetts, I will follow your prescription. Do you want me to stay as senator, or do you want me to leave my office? And according to all the records, by about a vote of 10-1, the cards poured in support of his staying on. And we know that he did and stayed in the Senate until his death in 2009.
And in the weeks that followed the accident, what did law enforcement do?
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, he was charged with leaving the scene of an accident and put on a probationary period, suspended license. But that was the only punishment that he endured. Now, I should say, as you said, from a legal perspective, he, according to his own memoir published just about the time he died, he suffered terrible guilt for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I can imagine so. And now he was up for re-election in 1970, is that right?
That is correct.
And obviously he was re-elected. Did he face an opponent that year?
He did, but he was elected with over 60% of the vote. So there were some people, as I've gone back and looked at the history of this, who, as I say, 10-1, obviously the one out of 10 who thought he should resign, leave office, but the 10 people to 1 thought he should stay in, and obviously they were the ones who voted for him. And some said, the family has suffered so many tragedies, sadly this is one of them, but we shouldn't take it out on him, which is an interesting way to look at the issue of responsibility. But indeed, he was elected by a landslide, re-elected in 1970 for another 6-year term to the Senate.
And he had been talked about as a potential presidential candidate in 1972. The nomination went to George McGovern, but was he considering putting his hat in the ring for 1972 to oppose Richard Nixon? And if so, what went into his decision-making process?
I think he knew it was too soon. I even in my research went back to 1970 and saw that his campaign asked his mother, who by then was 80 years old, to be out campaigning with senior citizens for her son in that 70 re-election campaign because they used the term the events of last summer. So they knew in the family, they knew in his advisory staff, they knew of all the people who had worked for him in the campaign that 1972 would be too close to Chappaquiddick. And as it turned out, he never again threw his hat in the ring, in part out of respect for his own family, because his children had had difficulties. His son, shortly after that, had cancer, bone cancer of the leg, had a leg amputated. So he knew that his family needed him. His wife had an alcohol problem. Clearly, the senator did as well, though it's not certain that he ever really accepted that. But they just had so many problems that he knew that for his family's sake, he shouldn't run for the presidency. He and the rest of the family always worried that he would suffer the same fate as his 2 brothers, that is, be assassinated.
But by 1980, apparently he felt enough time had gone by that he challenged Jimmy Carter for the Democratic presidential nomination. How did that play out?
He did. He overcame those concerns, both of his own and of the family, in 1980 because of ideological differences with Jimmy Carter. Ted Kennedy was much more liberal than the moderate Jimmy Carter, was much more in favor, for example, of national health care than Jimmy Carter was. And so he thought it was time that he spent that 11 years intervening between Chappaquiddick and 1980 that he could go ahead and run. And he did so very unsuccessfully, in starting with Roger Mudd's famous interview with him, asking him a pretty basic question for all presidential candidates: why do you want to be president? And he hemmed and hawed and had lots of non-fluencies and just couldn't quite come out with a cogent answer. And that seemed to sort of set the tone for the campaign. And he ended up with only about a third of the votes he would have needed for delegates to win at the nomination convention. But he went all the way to the convention and then gave the greatest speech of his career, saying that he was finally withdrawing and conceding to Jimmy Carter.
And did Jimmy Carter consider him to be a potent opponent?
I think Jimmy Carter, who probably always had a somewhat inflated sense of himself, and that he lived up to it in 1976 when he was Jimmy Who. No one knew who he was, the governor of Georgia. And so in that sense, his maybe somewhat inflated ego was correct and accurate. I think he was a little too... I don't want to use the term arrogant, but I think he had too positive a view of his reelection possibilities. He certainly was correct that he used the term whip Kennedy's ass, and he did. And so he went on to win the nomination. But some say, and I agree, that he was so damaged by the Kennedy attacks and the Kennedy candidacy for the nomination that he went on to lose in a landslide in 1980 to Ronald Reagan.
And then, of course, Kennedy stayed in the Senate for another 24 years.
Yes, all the way from 1980 up to his death in 2009, ended up a total of 47 years in the Senate, one of the longest-serving senators in American history.
Yeah, probably only beat by Robert Byrd.
I think that's right, and they, of course, were strong and close colleagues.
So what did Ted Kennedy accomplish during the rest of his career in the Senate? What are some of the notable landmarks of his legislative career?
Oh my goodness, you could go on for paragraphs and paragraphs and pages and pages, and I've done a whole book on the oral history that the Miller Center did of him that's just come out from Oxford, so I have whole lists of his legislative accomplishments. But certainly in the civil rights realm, for example, gay rights, he was very supportive of that, always supportive of the Voting Rights Act, and whenever that would come up for reconsideration, gender parity throughout the governmental system, health care. He couldn't quite get through. It took the ACA under Obama to get what he ultimately wanted after his death, but he was always, and I think this is important to note, I call Ted Kennedy a bipartisan partisan, and most people think of the latter term, that he was a rock-ribbed liberal Democratic partisan, and he was, and so he was always the stalking horse for conservatives and Republicans. But Ted Kennedy was very practical in his approach to legislating, and if he could only get the half loaf or the quarter loaf, he would do it. So one of the things in healthcare that he got in that intervening period from running for president and then his passing in 2009 was things like having pre-existing conditions covered and portability of health insurance. And he would work very strongly with people across the aisle. He worked with Nancy Kassebaum on that. He worked with Orrin Hatch on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. He worked to try to get comprehensive immigration reform with John McCain. So for all of his partisanship and liberality and his ideology that was certainly very left of center, he would pick out those areas where he could find common ground with his opponents, those who were conservative, those in the Republican Party, and they would find that quarter loaf or half a loaf. And
certainly President George W. Bush pointed to Senator Kennedy as a major ally on the No Child Left Behind Education Act.
That's another one indeed, and I always point out that when you go to the George W. Bush Library in Dallas, you will see a note, a handwritten note on display there from Ted Kennedy, and it said, thank you. It was a thank you note because George W. Bush, as soon as he got into the White House, and think about the 2000 election and how vitriolic that was, a few weeks later, he invited Ted Kennedy and his family down to the White House, to the theater there, to watch the movie 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis and about Ted Kennedy's brother, President Kennedy. And they had a nice picnic supper, and everybody watched the film. And so Ted Kennedy wrote a handwritten thank you note saying, I hope I'll be back at the White House and that we'll have some bill signings in the Rose Garden about education and health care. Well, he got certainly the No Child Left Behind piece of legislation through working with Republicans in both the House and the Senate, and George W. Bush was very grateful for that.
Just to sum up, what do you think is the lasting impact of Chappaquiddick on American politics?
Mm-hmm. I think certainly for Ted Kennedy it will always be a mark against him, as well it should. Not only was it irresponsible to bring about the death of a young woman, but not only his actions that led to that, but then certainly not reporting it immediately because it's possible that her life could have been saved. So that will always be a black mark against him on his record. In terms of its impact on political approaches to media and vice versa, how media cover I think it was in a time when a person like Ted Kennedy could go before the American people, accept responsibility, say I'm sorry, and then move on. In this day and age of social media, I wonder if that would be the case. I wonder if he could stay in office. But then we have to take a look at Donald Trump, who has certainly a colorful record behind him. And people have, in some ways, we've come that full circle, that some people have had to drop out of politics because of their terrible indiscretions. But yet someone like Donald Trump, who apparently has these indiscretions and admits to them in some instances, carries on. So I guess I would say that for the modern media era, but pre-social media era, the Ted Kennedy approach was go ahead, take responsibility, leave it up to the voters, and hope for the best. And in his case, it not only worked out the best for him, but I think one could make the argument, especially when he was working across the aisle with Republicans and got good pieces of legislation through, it worked for the good of the country.
Well, Barbara Perry, thank you for joining us again on The Score from Bering Drift. I appreciate your thoughts on this 50th anniversary of Chappaquiddick. Thank you.
Always happy to be with you, Rick.
You're listening to The Score from Bering Drift with your host, Rick Sincere.
Earlier this week, the Virginia General Assembly met in a special session called by Governor Ralph Northam for the purpose of considering firearms legislation. It didn't turn out the way the governor intended. The day after the special session convened and recessed, I spoke by telephone to Matthew Larosiere of the Firearms Policy Coalition. He explained what happened in Richmond and offered some thoughts on what might happen in the next few months.
We're a group of gun rights organizations and also civil rights organizations, really, that work together to ensure that the civil rights of people everywhere are respected. We do this by legal action. We file in various cases. We bring various cases. We do public education, research, and just generally things that are related to the preservation of our civil rights, and most importantly, the right to keep and bear arms.
Okay, thanks. What's in the news this week is the Virginia General Assembly was called into special session by Governor Ralph Northam for the purpose of discussing firearms regulations, new laws, but actually not much happened. Or am I misinterpreting the fact that nothing was considered or passed? Tell me what happened in Richmond yesterday, Tuesday, I guess it was Tuesday, July 9th.
Well, so what happened here was after the Virginia Beach shooting, Governor Ralph Northam was trying to package up a series of gun control laws, many of them typical, what you'd expect, and some of them quite outlandish, including making it a felony for leaving if a firearm is accessible to a 17-year-old in your home, whether or not anyone actually accessed it, and limiting firearm sales to one handgun per month. A lot of interesting and somewhat weird things that really aren't related to any public safety consideration. So Governor Northam thought that he could use this tragic event to kind of get the Virginia Republicans to bend the knee and get through some form of gun control. And what the general consensus is that this was political posturing just ahead of an important election cycle, and that he could hopefully to him, he could use this event to get some heat off of him for the scandals that were surrounding him earlier in the year, involving his abortion comments and previous use of blackface when he was in college. But it backfired. The assembly was unwilling to hear the proposals. They considered it they saw it to be a political stunt, and put it off until after the election to be debated.
And one of the things that the General Assembly agreed to do was to hold an unprecedented lame duck session on November 18th. And also they pushed off some of these proposals to be considered by I think it's called the Crime Commission, which is made up of members of the General Assembly, and they're going to, hold a hearing in August. What do you think will be the outcome of that?
Not much will will happen there. That's generally where these bills go to die. Given the way that the bills were put through and the kind of egregious nature of them and the fact that they were really not related to the shooting, they were really not related to public health, but just passage of gun control for gun control's sake, I think they'll probably die. They'll have a quiet end in the assembly.
If you're like me, you're probably receiving emails from people on all sides of these issues, speaking hyperbolically about their opponents. Do you think this is going to be a key issue in the November elections for the General Assembly?
A key issue. They're going to be talking about it. We're going to keep hearing about this type of thing, and we're going to, in fact, nationwide, not just here, we're going to keep hearing gun control proponents come up with novel and I'd like to say with air quotes creative new gun control propositions just to try to find something that sticks. And we're going to keep seeing this, frankly, until the Supreme Court finally steps in and sets the record straight and defines the parameters, sets an outline, puts out the boundaries of a playpen for gun control to operate within. Until that, we're going to see, multiple and random propositions, just anything that they think they can get to stick.
Well, you mentioned the Supreme Court. Of course, in the Heller decision, just more than 10 years ago now, Justice Scalia stated that despite the fact that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to keep and bear arms, that doesn't mean that states and local governments can't regulate the use or ownership of firearms. When you talk about parameters, is Scalia's view valid?
Well, the Heller decision was pretty, there's not much that we can get from it in terms of specific applications that are happening right now. The opinion was absolutely valid. It focused on there is a fundamental individual right to keep and bear arms, and that covers all bearable arms and other equipment as well. But that doesn't mean you can't regulate, right? It means that there's certain presumptions in place and there's certain standards that have to be met. That's what needs to be clarified, is where do those presumptions lie and what specifically is what does the city have to prove in order to get beyond the presumption that you have the right to keep and bear any weapon, right? That's the presumption. The question is standard. What is the hurdle that has to be overcome by legislatures who want to regulate?
Now, the bills that were presented in the special session of the General Assembly and then booted to the Crime Commission, if the Democrats win control of the House and the Senate in the fall, some of these bills that have never been voted on are going to be voted on, and they may pass. What do you think will need to be done in order to prevent that from happening from the perspective of proponents of the Second Amendment?
What we need to have is, like I was saying, is we need to have clear guidance from the Supreme Court on what is and what is not acceptable. Until we have that, it's basically like the Wild West for gun controllers. They're going to keep proposing, whatever. Like I was saying, this locking someone in prison because there was a firearm that could potentially be accessed by a 17-year-old, that's pretty extreme. That's the kind of situation where we have to have the Supreme Court saying, no, that is completely beyond the pale of what is acceptable. But until we get guidance from the Supreme Court, it's going to continue to be when it comes to proposing the gun control law.
So it sounds like one path towards the Supreme Court would be to have laws like this passed by the Virginia General Assembly, signed by the governor, put into law, and then challenged through the federal judicial system in the hopes that it will go to the Supreme Court and be overturned. Is that a strategy? Well,
that is a process, but that hasn't worked so far. It's been 10 years since the Supreme Court heard the Second Amendment case, and now we have one that was signed with the New York State Rifle and Pistol. It was a law that basically New York City said you can't transport a handgun outside of the city. That was set to be heard by the Supreme Court. New York City has been working with the state to try to get that case mooted, to try to escape review and prevent the court from setting clearer standards and prevent the court from clarifying to Americans where their rights, what the scope of the our ideas, where those boundaries are. As long as we have that type of behavior encouraged by, state and local law enforcement and lawmakers, it could be decades before we get these rights clarified. So we really need to put up the pressure publicly. We need to be talking about this type of things. We need to make it clear that it's not acceptable that the lawmakers are allowed to operate in this hazy mist and pretending that just because the Supreme Court hasn't specifically said something is not allowed, that they can do it. We need to have a respect for the fundamental individual right to keep and bear arms. We need to, make it clear that it should be observed that it's odd to lock people in cages just for owning a weapon, no matter what state the weapon is. The law should focus on what is at the root of violence, not putting a Band-Aid on the situation. And that's the type of thing, banning suppressors is one thing Northam wanted to do. There can be no justification for that, aside from the fact that a suppressor may have been used in the Virginia Beach shooting. If the shooter had used a gun that was painted purple, is that justification for banning purple guns? No. We need to improve the discourse, find some grounds to sit and talk and say that what we actually want to do here is save lives and design policy that is targeted at that.
Well, Matt, thank you for joining us on The Score from Bearing Drift.
Did you miss a previous episode of The Score? Look for our podcast at bearingdrift.com.
The Score's film critic, Tim Halsey, traveled to London, England to review a new play by David Mamet called Bitter Wheat, which addresses some prickly contemporary issues. The play stars John Malkovich. Here's Tim's review.
What can be said about David Mamet, who has survived and thrived as playwright, novelist, and filmmaker for nearly half a century now? Mamet is known not only for his pugnacious, foul-mouthed dialogue, but also for his explosive dramatic situations. And his best-known plays, like the slice-of-life drama American Buffalo, the caustic workplace whodunit Glengarry Glen Ross, or the Hollywood satire Speed the Plow, have dialogue so clipped and distinctive that it has inspired its own adjective, Mamet-esque. Mamet is in his early 70s, but shows no signs whatsoever of slowing down or playing nice. He was a controversial figure long before he announced his conversion to political conservatism in 2008, and now that he's very nearly the only openly conservative playwright working in the American theater, it looks as though critics on this side of the Atlantic will never forgive him. His last few plays, though frequently as accomplished as his best work of the past, have met with mostly withering reviews. So it makes sense that Mamet's devastatingly funny new satire, Bitter Wheat, is having its premiere on the other side of the Atlantic in London's West End. Film actor John Malkovich, returning to the stage for the first time since 2013, plays lead character Barney Fine, an obese, sociopathic, virtue-signaling movie mogul whose ravenous appetite for low-budget independent films is matched only by his penchant for sexual assault. When Fine lambastes a young writer for turning in an allegedly subpar script, he inadvertently makes clear that the real reason he's berating the writer is to avoid paying him for his work. The writer hurls a curse at him, saying, "I hope everything bad in life happens to you." In the theater, at least, the gods still listen to a well-phrased curse, and so it's not long before Barney Fine's webs of financial, artistic, and personal deceit unravel in spectacular fashion. When Fine sets his lecherous sights on a young Korean filmmaker, winningly portrayed by newcomer Joanna Kimbuk, she promptly turns the tables on him and creates the kind of scandal that the movie business can no longer ignore. Suddenly, Fine is surrounded by his accusers, he's lost control of his film company, and to top it all off, his mother has died under what may best be described as horrific circumstances. Mamet deftly skirts the thin line between terror and farce, as Fine tries to fend off a host of lawsuits while maintaining what's left of his dwindling empire. Although the 7-actor cast of Bitter Wheat is uniformly excellent, with Dune McKeon particularly good as Barney Fine's long-suffering secretary, the show really belongs to John Malkovich. Malkovich is a tornado of self-loathing, self-destructive energy, whether he's berating his subordinates and shoring up his left-wing credentials, or dissolving into puddles of self-pity while flailing on the stage like a turtle knocked on its back. As you've probably guessed, the character of Barney Fine is inspired in large part by disgraced film producer Harvey Weinstein, David Mamet even has Fine asked, when threatened with evidence of his wrongdoing, "Do you know how much money I donate to the Democratic Party?" But the real target of Mamet's bitter wheat is not just one man. Mamet indicts an entire culture of duplicity and moral relativism that makes possible someone like a Barney Fine, a Harvey Weinstein, a Jeffrey Epstein, or even, dare we say, a Donald J. Trump. How, Mamet asks, do people with no moral standards turn themselves into moral arbiters? And why do we let them do it? As Barney Fine describes his role as a film producer, Mamet unloads his most caustic observation to date of the entire Hollywood system. "We launder money," says Fine. "The films that shape the collective conscience of left-wing audiences around the world," explains Fine, "are thoroughly amoral business ventures created with the ill-gotten gains of global terror, human trafficking, and sweatshop labor, among other horrors." During the second act, we even see how this happens, as Fine tries to spin the mother of all Hollywood sob stories on behalf of a Syrian terrorist, in the hope that whatever magic he can conjure up to redeem this devil in the flesh can redeem him too. Toward the play's end, Fine notes that every one of his self-righteous films might as well be called Outrage and Insight. And the irony is that, as a perfect sociopath, he's as oblivious to the one as he is blind to the other. Mamet's conclusion to his tale of a cultural con job gone wrong, though hilarious on the surface, is also completely devoid of hope. Bitter Wheat is a shockingly brief play, running at just under an hour and a half plus intermission. The production, currently at London's Garrick Theatre, running through September 21st, is directed in a straightforward, no-nonsense fashion by David Mamet himself, who keeps stage clutter to the bare minimum and makes sure that every line and every thought hit the audience with maximum force. There is a legitimate question as to whether a play so brief, so apparently slight, and so blisteringly funny as Bitter Wheat can offer an adequate response to the moral rot it exposes. But Bitter Wheat is, at the very least, a good play, and possibly even a great one, which makes it, for better or for worse, the best response the theater has produced to date to our moment of cultural crisis.
The Score is produced by Bearing Drift, Virginia's top site for news and politics. To learn more, visit BearingDrift.com.
Virginia Tech historian Ed Guitry teaches about World War II to the Corps of Cadets. About 10 years ago, he discovered a trove of documents in the National Archives that had largely been forgotten. Surveys of members of the armed forces conducted during the 1940s that included some amazingly candid comments. I spoke by telephone to Professor Guitry on Wednesday morning while he was visiting Milwaukee. You were recently at the National Archives and you discovered a trove of documents from the World War II era that apparently had been forgotten for a long time. Before we talk about the significance of what you found, tell me how you happened to be there and how you found these documents.
I'd be happy to, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about the project. I came across these sources actually in 2009, so about a decade ago. At the time, I was a postdoc fellow at the University of Virginia, and at that point I had done a lot of work in the history of the social sciences, and I was interested in doing more with the war period. So I knew that a group of social scientists and psychologists had been working with the Army and conducting these interviews and surveys with soldiers. And there was kind of an innocuous sounding title in the catalog for a box or two of microfilm roll that mentioned that they were responses, handwritten responses to these surveys. And there was only one copy that I knew of in the country, and so I went up to the archives and I ordered it up, and I put the first film into the microfilm reader and was just amazed at what I had found. And the National Archives had tried to promote it, but the way that the record groups and the catalog work at the National Archives, it can be kind of hard to find these records. And so I knew other historians who had worked on this research branch in the Army and had worked with some of the other publications. Even they had not worked with these sources. So I knew that they were special once I started to read them, and knew at that point in time that the public really needed to have access to them in the worst possible way.
And what was on this microfilm? It was a survey of enlisted men in all the branches of the military. Do I understand that correctly?
So the research branch was in the War Department, worked primarily with the Army, but worked beyond the Army. It was of soldiers, it was of enlisted men, officers, different individuals, and they surveyed soldiers across the world and all the different theaters across the war from 41 to 45 and then even beyond that. And over the course of the war, they had surveyed approximately just over 500,000 soldiers. So a lot of servicemen and women, and there were some servicewomen, were surveyed, and they're represented in this collection.
500,000 responses is amazing for any sort of social science survey. Has that ever been replicated in the history of the military?
No, definitely not. They continued until the mid-1950s. They've revived, and they're doing more of it now. But nothing on this scale that I'm aware of, either before certainly or after. It was really a major endeavor involved leading social and behavioral scientists in the country at the time, and was quite successful. So in a lot of the surveys, we have multiple choice data, the kind of quantitative data, but for a select group of records, they preserve the handwritten reflections. And oftentimes in the survey, what they would do is they would have an open-ended prompt at the end of the survey, basically asking the respondent if there was anything else they wanted to add, that they could write what they wanted. And a whole trove of these were saved and put on microfilm, and that's what I read 2009 with those handwritten responses. So there's about 65,000 pages of handwritten responses.
That's a lot of reading to do. What were the kinds of questions that were on the survey? Not the open-ended questions, but sort of the multiple choice type things. What were the questions that the social scientists were interested in getting answers to?
They were interested in all facets of their experience. A number of the questions would ask them for demographic data, where they were born, their education, about their family members, but a lot of them focused obviously on their wartime experience. Would be everything from the quality of the training, the food, transportation, leave, even race relations, social relations. They would ask them about their clothing, what they preferred to read, the movies they liked to watch, just a whole gamut of their experience, the soldiers' experience in the U.S. Army during the war.
Now, were the answers to these surveys then transmitted to the Army brass, as it were, and was it used to influence the way the military organized itself and treated its soldiers?
Definitely. There was some resistance, particularly from the very top, from the Secretary of War at the beginning when they first proposed the idea. And he initially didn't want the soldiers to be surveyed. This was not something that they would do normally. But what the researchers were able to do was to convince the brass that this was valuable information for commands, that this public wasn't going to become public knowledge, public information, but it would be given to them and be confidential. And they did reproduce the results of surveys for the soldiers themselves. But the brass, the officers, they did want this information, and it did influence policy, and in some significant ways. Some of it the soldiers would have no idea the policy that came out resulted from these surveys, but some they would. So the point system, there was a point system used at the end of the war for demobilization, and that was the result of the research. One of the more significant results was the GI Bill. There was a lot of research that was done on the educational needs of soldiers and what they wanted as they were coming out of the war. So that's another area. The other is in race relations. At the beginning of the war, there was a lot of pressure to include African Americans and give them equal opportunities. well, during the war, there was some de facto desegregation, and they surveyed white officers to find out how black soldiers performed. And the results were really surprising. They said they are performing just as well as whites. And that, white soldiers. And that research helped desegregate the Army and the armed forces after the war.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, let's talk a bit about the written open-ended responses, because in the article I read that you published in The Conversation, it was republished in the Daily Progress, there were some really fascinating quotations you had, and I guess it was in part because the responses were anonymous, so the soldiers felt unconstrained in what they had to say. What were some examples of the prompted, open-ended responses?
Yeah. The way that they sold it to the brass, and telling the researchers told the brass that this was going to be valuable information for them. The soldiers, they reassured them that their commanding officers would never know what they wrote, that this was going to be anonymous, these were going to be anonymous responses. And so many of the respondents that I had read their handwritten responses, they took that to heart. And so they saw this as perhaps their only opportunity to tell the Army what the Army was doing right or wrong, and their opinions about the war more broadly, as well as about what the U.S. Army was doing. So they were incredibly frank, candid in their responses. Early on, especially when they were dealing with a lot of placement issues, there were lots of complaints from soldiers about where they were placed in the jobs that they were doing. And they said that if you just the soldiers said, if you just put me in the right job, I will help in the war. So there was a lots of feedback to the Army saying, I want to contribute, but you need to use the skills that I have. They spoke frankly about the divisions in the United States at the time. Some of it was regional. They were talking about how some soldiers, if they were in a division in a regiment that was dominated by a certain region, they would talk about the regional divisions and feel alienated. The African American soldiers really candidly about race relations, about tensions, about what they saw as the hypocrisy of fighting a war for democracy when they were still under Jim Crow.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the things we know now is that after the war, a lot of the men and women who served became civic leaders in their community. Many members of Congress, several U.S. presidents. Was there anything in those surveys that indicated how the post-World War II generation of veterans would approach civic life when they, got demobilized?
There was a genuine belief, I think, in a lot of respondents that their service was going to be honored after the war. And even in these surveys, they were asked a lot about their expectations about what kind of jobs they wanted, what kind of training they wanted. And you don't get the sense of, there was some sense in which they didn't believe that the government was going to take care of them. You do see some of that. But then you also see a lot of trust that they had served the country, and they felt like the country was going to, the government was going to take care of them and reward them for their service. And so you see, in today's politics, you see a lot of tension and hostility, or a lot of skepticism about what the government was going to be able to do, or what it should do or shouldn't do. And you just don't see that same level of conflict among a number of these soldiers.
Well, I wish we could go on and talk about this for a half hour or more. This sounds fascinating. What are you going to do with the research that you've done so far? What are you going to be writing a book about this, or teaching a course? What's the future of these survey documents that you've been examining?
So I'm personally interested as a historian, so I'm going to be working on a book, and I'll give conference papers. I've really integrated the project into my teaching at Virginia Tech. I teach a lot of cadets. I teach World War II often. But I've also gotten a grant from the National Endowment for Humanities to make these sources publicly available. So for the next couple of years, we're going to be working on getting, and we're in the process of getting all those 65,000 pages of handwritten responses transcribed. They've already been digitized. And we're going to create a public website so that anybody who has access to the Internet can read these responses from the soldiers. That's the ultimate aim, is just to get this out there in the public so that the public can read.
Well, that's a terrific goal. Ed Guitry from Virginia Tech, thank you for joining us on the Score from Bering Drift. I appreciate your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing where this historical research goes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Rick. I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you again, and I hope we get a chance to talk again sometime.
Do you have an idea for future episodes of The Score? Write to host Rick Sincere at ricksincere@gmail.com.
Earlier in the program, we talked about Chappaquiddick with Dr. Barbara Perry. Last year, Tim Halsey reviewed a feature film about that story. With the 50th anniversary coming up, this is a good time to hear Tim's review again.
In July of 1969, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy drove his car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, drowning 28-year-old campaign strategist Mary Jo Kopechne. The incident dogged Kennedy for the rest of his life and brought the Kennedys' dream of Camelot on the Potomac to an ignoble end. But not until nearly 50 years later has an American film focused on the story of Chappaquiddick without apologies or excuses. Now in theaters, John Curran's film Chappaquiddick begins on the day of Kopechne's death and ends 1 week later with Ted Kennedy's nationally televised statement about the accident. Australian character actor Jason Clarke, whom you may have noticed in films like Zero Dark 30 and Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, takes center stage as the senator, and his performance is a wonder to behold. Both childlike and calculating, empathetic and sociopathic, this Ted Kennedy turns on a dime, from mouthing platitudes about the family legacy to planning drunken orgies with his secretaries on Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard is where we meet Kopechne, portrayed by House of Cards actress Kate Mara as a young idealist with a very bright future. The early scenes between Kopechne and Kennedy have an almost fatalistic air about them. As the campaign worker succumbs to the senator's dissolute charm, we can almost feel the dark waters closing in around her. It's after her death, rendered in brief but terrifying detail, that the film kicks into high gear as an army of cronies, party operatives, and family members gather to protect the senator at any cost. These supporting roles are expertly cast, and the actors seem to relish their overripe theatrical dialogue. Two performances stand out. Ed Helms, best known for The Hangover, plays Joe Gargan, a cousin of the senator adopted in the Kennedy fold as an all-purpose fixer. As he begs the senator to take responsibility for his actions, Helms's Gargan becomes the film's de facto conscience, while bedridden Kennedy patriarch Joe Sr., portrayed by Bruce Dern at his most malevolent, urges his son toward the opposite course. Though the ending is a foregone conclusion, Chappaquiddick writers Taylor Allen and Andrew Logan managed to keep us in suspense until the very last shot. Chappaquiddick is not a great film. Its editing is sometimes on the nose, and a few of its insights land with a thud. But Chappaquiddick is a good film, a smart, modern morality play that charts Ted Kennedy's descent from lovable heel to outright villain.
You're listening to The Score from Bering Drift with your host, Rick Sincere.
Here's a hint about next week's episode of The Score, when we will devote the whole hour to a single topic, another anniversary coming up.
We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man. And only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war. I do not say that we should or will go unprotected against the hostile misuse of space any more than we go unprotected against the hostile use of land or sea. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around this globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
"30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
Here we got a roll program.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
That's all the time we have this week on The Score. For all the writers and editors at Bering Drift, I'm Rick Sincere. Be sure to return next week for more news, reviews, and interviews. Tell your friends where to find us, and feel free to leave comments and questions on our website at beringdrift.com. We'll be waiting for you.
Do you have an idea for future episodes of The Score? Write to host Rick Sincere at ricksincere@gmail.com. The Score is produced by Bering Drift, Virginia's top site for news and politics. To learn more, visit beringdrift.com.